My name is Ralph Mercer, and I am 76 years old. I live in a small, one-story house on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. A house that once rang with the voices of my wife and our daughter. A house that held the smell of Sunday roasts, the laughter of grandchildren, the muted quarrels that every family knows, and the comfortable silence of companionship. Now it is only me and the steady ticking of the old clock in the hallway, a clock I wind every night, as though by keeping its hands moving I can keep myself moving as well. I retired 15 years ago after teaching history at the local high school for more than 3 decades. And for a time after retirement, I thought I would finally enjoy the fruits of years of labor, traveling a bit with my wife, visiting museums I had always wanted to see, reading without the burden of grading papers late into the night, and spending long afternoons with my grandchildren, who, at the time, were still young enough to run toward me with open arms. Those dreams lasted only a few short years before illness claimed my wife, and the routines we had built together, from the way she stirred sugar into her tea to the way she left the porch light on when I went for evening walks, dissolved into memories that became heavier to carry with every passing year. I try not to complain because people my age know well enough that life is a long string of compromises, losses, and unexpected turns, and it is only the young who still think everything will go according to plan. Yet silence is not the same as peace. The days stretch out in ways I never imagined. The mornings are the hardest because they remind me of how different life used to be. I still make breakfast the way Margaret, my wife, used to like it. Scrambled eggs with a dash of pepper and toast slightly overdone, though I never finish the meal and often end up throwing most of it away. It is a strange ritual, but it keeps her presence close, and without it the house feels unbearable, as though the walls themselves were leaning inward. After breakfast, I sit at the kitchen table and read the newspaper, not so much out of interest, but because I have to do something to prove to myself that I am still part of the world, still aware of what is happening beyond my street. The names of politicians and entertainers blur together, and I rarely recall the details of the articles by the afternoon, but turning the pages gives the impression of participating in something greater than my loneliness. My daughter, Elaine, calls me from time to time, but the conversations are short and efficient, as though she is ticking a box on her long list of obligations. She always sounds distracted, her voice clipped, and if I try to stretch the call into real conversation, she steers it back toward practical matters. "How's your health, Dad? Are you taking your pills? Did you pay the property taxes?" I answer as best I can, but I feel her impatience over the line, the way she breathes when I pause too long, the way her tone hardens if I wander into memory or sentiment. I know she loves me in her own way, but her love is wrapped in layers of distance and calculation, and sometimes I suspect she has begun to view me not as a person, but as a set of responsibilities and perhaps a future inheritance to be managed. She is married to Martin, an engineer who has always been polite to me but never warm, a man who speaks in facts and numbers and who seems to consider emotions a kind of weakness. I try to be generous in my judgment because I know the world today demands different things from people than it did when I was young. Yet I cannot shake the feeling that around them I am tolerated rather than welcomed, a guest who stays too long at his own table. There are 2 grandchildren, Michael and Claire, both in their 20s now, who once drew me pictures of castles and knights, who once asked me to tell them bedtime stories about explorers and lost civilizations, who once climbed onto my lap as if it were the most natural place in the world. They are polite when we meet, but they are always looking at their phones, always in a hurry to leave, and our exchanges are awkward, as though I am a distant relative rather than the grandfather who babysat them when they were small. I keep their old drawings in a folder in my desk, and sometimes I take them out and trace the crooked lines of their handwriting, reminding myself that once upon a time I was someone important in their lives, not an afterthought to be brushed aside. The truth is, I have become invisible in gradual increments, not in a sudden cruel gesture, but in the slow erosion of attention, affection, and respect. At first it was the holidays that shifted from being held in my house with Margaret's cooking and my storytelling to being relocated to Elaine's bigger suburban home, where my role was reduced to bringing a bottle of wine and sitting quietly in the corner. Then the visits grew fewer, the invitations less frequent, Until now, weeks pass without a word. When I call, sometimes no one answers, and when they do, it is with the harried tone of people who have something better to do. I know they are busy, of course I know, and I try to forgive the neglect by telling myself that I, too, was once a busy parent, caught up in deadlines and obligations, not realizing how quickly the years were passing. Yet there is a difference. I never made my parents feel like burdens, never left them out of conversations at the table, never allowed them to sit in silence while others spoke as if they weren't there. Despite all this, I hold on to a stubborn hope that things might change, that one day Elaine will look at me not as a problem to be solved, but as her father, the man who once carried her on his shoulders, who stayed up late grading papers so she could have piano lessons, who sacrificed trips and luxuries so she could attend the college she dreamed of. It is foolish, perhaps, to expect gratitude or recognition, but I have learned that without some small ember of hope, the days become unbearable. That ember keeps me putting on clean clothes in the morning, keeps me polishing the shoes I rarely wear, keeps me watering the flowers in the front yard, even though no one but the mailman notices. Loneliness is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet certainty that no one will knock on the door. I have neighbors, of course, but they are younger, busy with children and work, and I am careful not to impose. I wave to them when I see them mowing their lawns or carrying groceries, but I rarely exchange more than a few sentences. People are polite, but they do not linger. They sense the weight of solitude and shy away from it, afraid it might be contagious. In the evenings, I watch the light fade over the rooftops and remember when that time of day was filled with voices, when Margaret would ask me to take out the trash while she finished washing dishes, when Elaine would phone to ask if she could borrow the car, when grandchildren would beg to stay up just 15 more minutes. Now, as the sky darkens, I sit in my chair by the window and listen to the hum of the refrigerator, a sound so constant I hardly hear it until the power flickers, and it stops, and then the silence becomes unbearable. There are moments when I consider selling the house, moving into an apartment where I might meet other people my age, where perhaps there are organized dinners or games, but then I think of leaving the memories behind, and my resolve collapses. Every corner of this house carries Margaret's presence, the floral curtains she chose for the kitchen, the indentation of her chair in the living room, the faint smell of her perfume still clinging to the scarves in the closet. To leave would feel like betraying her, as though I were admitting that our life together had been reduced to relics. So I stay, a sentinel in a museum of my own past, waiting for visitors who rarely come. And yet even in this stillness, even with the quiet ache of being overlooked, I try to maintain a dignity that no neglect can erase. I pay my bills on time, I keep the lawn neat, I write letters to old colleagues who sometimes reply, and I read the books I always meant to finish. I remind myself that invisibility is not the same as non-existence. But as the years accumulate, I cannot ignore the creeping suspicion that in the eyes of my own family, I have already begun to fade, like a photograph left too long in the sun, the edges blurring, the details dissolving, until one day they will forget that I was ever vibrant, ever needed, ever loved. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, not as a handwritten note or a warm phone call, but as a curt message on my answering machine, the kind of thing one might leave for a plumber or an acquaintance. Yet because of who it came from, I replayed it twice, listening for traces of sincerity that might be hidden beneath the brisk tone. It was Elaine's voice, precise and businesslike as always, saying that she and Martin were planning to have dinner with some friends at a new restaurant downtown, that it would be a nice occasion for me to come along, and that it might do me good to get out of the house for once. There was no flourish of affection, no suggestion that she had missed me, but the very fact that she had thought to include me at all felt like a small miracle. For a long time afterward, I sat staring at the phone, wondering if I had heard correctly, and then I played the message again just to be certain, as though I feared it might vanish if I didn't hold on to it with every sense. It had been months since I had last been invited to anything beyond a rushed holiday lunch, and the notion that my daughter wanted me at her table, even if only in the company of her friends, filled me with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that I hadn't felt in years. I spent the following days preparing in ways that would probably seem absurd to anyone else. I ironed my best suit, the one Margaret had always insisted looked distinguished, even though it was slightly loose on me now, and I polished my shoes until I could see the reflection of the window in their surface. I rehearsed small talk in my head, recalling anecdotes from my teaching years, stories about history that could be made light enough for conversation, yet interesting enough to show I still had something to contribute. I checked my watch battery, had my glasses cleaned at the optometrist, and even practiced smiling in the mirror so that I would not appear too severe or melancholy. It may sound foolish, but when you have been on the margins of family life for as long as I have, the chance to step back in, even for a single evening, feels monumental, and you do not wish to squander it. I wanted to prove to them, and perhaps more importantly to myself, that I was not the feeble old man they sometimes made me out to be, but still the father who had guided them, the husband who had loved, the teacher who had inspired students. On the evening of the dinner, I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early, unwilling to risk being late. It was a fashionable place, the kind of establishment that prided itself on its dim lighting and leather-bound menus, with tall vases of lilies on each table and waiters who carried themselves with a mix of detachment and superiority. I asked for the reservation under my daughter's name and was shown to a long table by the window, where no one else had arrived yet. Sitting there alone, I felt conspicuous, as though every other patron was silently wondering why an old man in a slightly dated suit was occupying such a place. I busied myself by studying the menu, squinting at the elaborate descriptions of dishes I barely recognized, until at last I heard Elaine's voice behind me, bright with the kind of false cheer that barely conceals irritation. "Dad, you're early," she said, bending to kiss me on the cheek in a gesture so perfunctory it felt rehearsed. Martin followed, carrying himself with that familiar stiffness, his handshake firm but empty, and behind them trailed another couple, younger, fashionable, who I learned were friends of theirs from Martin's office. From the very beginning, the rhythm of the evening seemed to move around me rather than through me. The conversation flowed swiftly between the others, filled with jargon from their work, references to vacations I had never heard about, and quick exchanges of laughter that left me smiling uncertainly, as though I had missed the cue. Whenever I tried to interject, my words landed like pebbles in a rushing river, quickly swallowed and carried away. I mentioned a recent article I had read about changes in education, hoping to spark a discussion, but Elaine interrupted with a tight smile, saying, "Dad still reads the newspaper, isn't that quaint?" And the others chuckled politely before resuming their own thread. I attempted another contribution, recalling a historical anecdote connected to one of the dishes on the menu, but Martin waved it off with a muttered comment about ancient trivia, and the subject was closed before it had even begun. As the evening wore on, I became increasingly aware of my own silence, of the way my presence seemed to be tolerated rather than welcomed, as though I had been included not because they wanted me there, but because leaving me behind would have looked unkind. My daughter, sitting beside me, leaned more toward her friends than toward me, her back half turned, her laughter aimed in the opposite direction. When the waiter came to take orders, Martin spoke over me, suggesting the fish for me because it was easier to chew, and when I tried to protest, Elaine patted my hand as one might calm a restless child, saying, "It's better for you, Dad. Trust me." I nodded, though the humiliation burned, and I wondered if the others noticed how my autonomy was being quietly erased, or if to them it simply looked like ordinary family banter. At one point, the young woman from Martin's office turned to me and asked what I did before retirement, and for a moment I brightened, grateful for the chance to speak about something that had defined my life. I began to explain how I had taught history for over 30 years, how I had tried to make the past vivid for my students by telling stories rather than reciting dates. But before I could finish, Elaine cut in with a laugh, saying, "Yes, Dad's stories could go on forever, couldn't they?" And the conversation shifted back to mortgages and travel plans. I sat there with my fork poised, feeling as though the very core of who I was, my vocation, my passion, had been dismissed with a wave of her hand. Dessert came, and with it a moment that I will never forget, though I wish I could. I had excused myself to the restroom, and as I returned, I heard my daughter's voice, lowered but not enough to escape my ears, speaking to her friends at the table. "We really have to start thinking about a care facility," she was saying. "Dad forgets things more and more, and he really shouldn't be living alone. It's dangerous. Honestly, I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." The words struck me like a physical blow. I stood frozen a few feet away, unable to move, hearing Martin add, "It's just a matter of time. We'll need to handle the house, too. It's far too much for him, and it'll make things easier once it's sold." The other couple murmured sympathetic noises, and then Elaine's voice again, light with a brittle humor. "At dinner, he barely says anything. Half the time it's like he isn't even here." I forced myself to walk the rest of the way to the table, my face carefully composed, though my hands trembled. I sat down, and no one acknowledged that I had returned, as though my invisibility had become literal, as though I had ceased to be part of the evening altogether. They finished their desserts, settled the bill, and rose from the table in a bustle of coats and chatter, while I followed silently behind, carrying with me the sharp knowledge that I had just overheard the truth. In their eyes I was already fading, already half erased, already a problem to be solved rather than a man to be loved. The drive home from that dinner should have been a relief, the kind of weary return after a long evening where one feels the comfort of routine waiting in the quiet familiarity of one's own house. But instead it became a journey of silence that seemed to echo louder than any argument could have. Elaine and Martin offered me a ride, though the gesture felt more like obligation than kindness. And as we sat in the car, the conversation between them flowed above and around me, their voices filled with the shorthand of people who share a life together and have little space for a third party who is not entirely welcome. They spoke about plans for the coming week, about renovations they wanted for their kitchen, about a trip they were considering with friends, and though I sat less than 2 feet away in the back seat, not once did they include me in their words. Not. Once did they turn to ask if I had enjoyed myself. Not once did they look back to acknowledge my presence. I might as well have been a parcel strapped into the seat, something being delivered from one place to another. When they pulled up in front of my house, Martin kept the engine running, his fingers tapping impatiently on the steering wheel, while Elaine leaned over her shoulder and said, "Here we are, Dad. Get some rest, all right? And don't forget your pills." There was no warmth in her tone, only the efficient cadence of someone finishing a task. I stepped out, clutching my coat tighter around me against the night air, and for a brief moment I thought she might lower the window, might add a word of reassurance or affection, but the car pulled away before I had even reached my front door, the red glow of the taillights vanishing down the street like the last trace of hope. Inside, the house greeted me with its usual stillness, but this time the silence felt hostile, as though it were complicit in the invisibility I had just endured. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the darkened window where my reflection looked back at me, lined and weary, and I wondered if perhaps they were right, if perhaps I was indeed disappearing from the world, and only the faintest outline remained. The days that followed brought no comfort, only a deepening sense that something fundamental had shifted. Elaine did not call, not even to ask if I had enjoyed the evening, and when I left her a message thanking her for including me, she did not reply. Instead, I received a voicemail from Martin, brief and curt, reminding me to check the batteries in my smoke detectors and to be careful with the stove, as though I were a careless child rather than the man who had once repaired his car engine in the dead of winter when he was too incompetent to do it himself. The patronizing tone cut deeper than the words because it revealed what they truly thought of me, not as a father or mentor, but as a liability, someone to be managed and contained. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself they meant well, but the unease lingered, a shadow that stretched across every room in my house. It was not long before small humiliations began to accumulate, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern too obvious to ignore. When I called to ask if I might see the grandchildren, Elaine told me they were too busy with their lives and suggested that I not pressure them, as though my desire to see them was selfish rather than natural. When I asked if I could come by for Sunday dinner, she replied that the house was a mess and that it wasn't a good time, though I later heard through a neighbor that they had hosted friends that very same evening. On the rare occasions when we did meet, often at public places chosen by them, they corrected me mid-sentence, insisted that I was misremembering stories or gently reminded me of health problems I did not have, repeating to anyone who would listen that Dad's memory is slipping or Dad's not as steady on his feet as he used to be. I felt myself shrinking under these narratives, reduced not by age itself, but by their insistence that I was fragile, forgetful, and incompetent, until even strangers began to glance at me with pity when they heard my own daughter describing me this way. One afternoon, Elaine came by unannounced, the first time in months she had set foot in my house, and instead of sitting with me or asking how I was, she wandered through the rooms as though inspecting them, pulling open cupboards, looking at the state of the refrigerator, checking the expiration dates on medicine bottles. "You can't go on like this, Dad," she said, shaking her head. "It's too much for you. Living alone isn't safe anymore." When I asked what she meant, she gave me a thin smile and replied, "We're just worried about you. You forget things. You left the porch light on all day last week." I wanted to shout that leaving a light on was not evidence of dementia, that I was capable of managing my own home, but the words stuck in my throat, choked by the realization that she had already made up her mind. She was not asking, she was declaring. In her eyes, I was already half removed from this house, from this independence, from the dignity of making my own decisions. That night, as I sat alone at my kitchen table, I began to replay the dinner at the restaurant in my mind, not as an isolated incident, but as the beginning of a deliberate pattern. The laughter that excluded me, the decisions made over my head, the comments about my memory, the whispered conversations I had overheard, all of it pointed toward a conclusion I had been too reluctant to face. They were preparing to erase me not just socially but legally, to strip me of control over my home and finances under the guise of concern. The humiliation at the dinner table had not been accidental. It had been the opening act in a campaign to make me look weak, dependent, and invisible, so that when the time came to move me into a facility and take control of what I owned, no one would question it. The first escalation of this new reality came not from an argument or confrontation, but from the realization itself, the sinking knowledge that I was no longer being treated as a man, but as a fading object to be managed. I had always thought the danger of growing old was the body weakening, the joints aching, the memory dimming. I never imagined the greater danger would be the hands of one's own family, gently but firmly pushing you toward invisibility, convincing the world you were already gone before you had even drawn your last breath. That was the night I understood. What had happened at dinner was not the end. It was the beginning, and if I did nothing, they would succeed in making me vanish entirely. The moment when everything shifted from uneasy suspicion to undeniable certainty came one evening in early autumn, when the air had just begun to cool and the leaves had taken on the first hint of gold. Elaine called and told me she wanted to stop by with Martin, which in itself was unusual enough to make me straighten the house as though company were coming, polishing the dining table and setting out cups for tea. I told myself perhaps this was the reconciliation I had quietly longed for. Perhaps they had realized how distant they had become. Perhaps they wanted to spend real time with me. I tried to believe this fragile hope as I waited, listening for the sound of their car in the driveway, the same way I used to wait for Margaret's return from the store. When they finally arrived, however, it was immediately clear that warmth was not the purpose of their visit. They came in briskly, without the small courtesies of admiration or interest, and sat across from me at the kitchen table with expressions that carried a seriousness which turned my stomach before a single word was spoken. Elaine folded her hands and began in the careful tone of someone reciting a speech rehearsed many times in her head. "Dad, we've been thinking a lot about your situation. You're alone in this house, and it's too much for you. You've done well, but you can't keep it up forever. Martin and I both feel it would be safer and healthier if you moved into a retirement community where you'd have help close by." I opened my mouth to protest, but Martin cut in with his steady engineer's logic, laying out points as though I were an equation to be solved. "The house is old, maintenance is expensive, you don't drive anymore, and there's no one nearby if something happens. It's inevitable, Ralph. Sooner or later, you'll need help, and it's better to do it now while you can still make the transition." His tone was calm, but beneath it was an impatience that told me the decision had already been made, that they were not asking for my opinion, but rather informing me of the course they intended to pursue. I sat there in silence, listening to my own daughter explain why I no longer belonged in my own home, and I felt the walls closing in. The tea I had poured for them grew cold, untouched on the table, as though it too understood there was no real hospitality here, only business disguised as concern. At last I found my voice and asked quietly, "And what will happen to this house if I leave it?" Elaine did not flinch. She had expected the question. "We can sell it," she replied smoothly, "and use the money for your care, for the facility, for your needs. That way everything will be organized, and you won't have to worry." Martin nodded as though the matter was settled, and for a long moment the room seemed to tilt, the furniture and familiar walls shifting into something unfamiliar, hostile, as if my own home had already been stripped from me. The breaking point came not from their words, however, but from the casual cruelty of what followed. Elaine rose from her chair, walked to the bookshelf in the living room, and picked up a photograph of Margaret and me on our wedding day. She studied it for a moment and said, with a kind of absent-minded detachment, "It's strange to think how long ago this was. Sometimes I wonder how much of it you even remember now." I felt something inside me fracture, a deep and quiet break, because in that moment I realized she was not simply speaking of practicality. She was speaking of erasure. She was planting the narrative that my memory was unreliable, that my grasp of the past was slipping, that I was no longer a trustworthy witness to my own life. The photograph trembled in her hands, and I wanted to snatch it back, to protect it from the implication that my love, my history, my very identity could be reduced to the question of whether I still remembered it correctly. That night after they left, I could not sleep. I wandered the house in the dark, touching the backs of chairs, the worn handle of the kitchen door, the frame of the photograph Elaine had held, as though by laying my hands on these objects I could reassure myself that my life was still intact. I went to my desk and pulled out the folder where I kept important documents, bank statements, the deed to the house, my will. For years I had barely looked at them, trusting that such matters would only become relevant in some distant future. Now, however, I examined every page with new eyes, searching for the traps I had ignored, the signatures that might have handed away control without my realizing it. To my surprise, I found that the house was still entirely in my name, unencumbered and secure, though I remembered faintly that years ago Elaine had asked about putting it jointly under her name for convenience. I had refused then, not out of suspicion but out of stubbornness, insisting that it remain as it always had been. That small act of obstinacy now seemed like the only thing standing between me and the void. It was then, in the stillness of that sleepless night, that I understood the true midpoint of my story. I could no longer simply hope that their behavior was a matter of busyness or misunderstanding. I could no longer excuse the dismissive comments. As careless slips, I could no longer wait passively for affection that was not coming. I had heard them speak of selling my home as though I were already gone. I had seen the calculation in their eyes, and I had felt the sting of being portrayed as forgetful, incompetent, half-vanished. The time of waiting was over. This was no longer about dignity alone. It was about survival, about preserving the last fragments of control and meaning in a life that others had already begun to strip away. The days after that sleepless night unfolded with a peculiar brightness, not because anything around me had improved, but because the fog of doubt had burned off and everything came into sharp, almost painful focus. And in that clarity I began to move through the world as a man who has decided that the next indignity will not be allowed to land without a record, a rebuttal, and a consequence. I started with what I could control. At dawn, I walked to my desk, opened the folder where I kept the deed and my will, and added a yellow legal pad on top, writing the date and time in a careful hand the way I used to mark the first page of a new lesson plan, then listed what I knew and what I feared, a ledger of facts and possibilities that steadied me by existing on paper rather than swirling in my head. Then I called the bank and asked them to place additional verification flags on my accounts, to require in-person identification and a passphrase for any transfers, and I drove to the branch with the old driver's license I still kept current only. because the memory of Margaret's insistence on order had kept me renewing it, and I sat with a manager who remembered I used to chaperone the school's debate club and who listened without rushing as I explained that my daughter had begun to speak about selling my house as if I were already tucked away elsewhere. She nodded with the weary sympathy of someone who has seen too many variations of the same story and helped me freeze my credit, set up alerts, and add a note to my profile that no one, no matter how close, could act on my behalf without a notarized power of attorney that bore a date after the one I planned to sign that very day, naming someone who was not my daughter or her husband. The next step was a drive to the county recorder's office, a place I had taken civics classes to during field trips decades ago, and it felt oddly fitting to return now, not as a teacher, but as a citizen attempting to defend the most basic civic possession, the roof over his head. The clerk was patient as I asked whether any liens or quitclaim deeds had been filed in recent months, and I stood very still while she scrolled, my heart ticking like the old hallway clock, until she shook her head and said nothing new appeared. Beyond the mortgage I had paid off long ago and a tax payment automatically recorded every year. Relief arrived not as a warm wave but as a crisp breath that made me decide to keep moving while momentum favored me, so I stopped at the post office and asked whether anyone had requested a change of address for my mail. The clerk checked and said that a request had been started online but flagged for identity verification, and I signed the appropriate form to block any future attempt without my signature. By the time I pulled back into my driveway, the sun had climbed to its noon stance. My hands were steady instead of trembling, and I felt for the first time in months that the outline of myself had darkened, as if someone had traced over a fading photograph to restore the lines that mattered. In the afternoon, Elaine called to say she and Martin would be swinging by, her phrase careful and light, as though this were a casual drop-in, and I would have believed that fiction if I had not already seen the earlier visit for what it was. They arrived with a third person who introduced herself as a care coordinator, a breezy woman with a stack of glossy brochures whose practiced smile suggested a career in selling life changes to reluctant customers. She sat at my kitchen table, without waiting to be invited, and fanned out pamphlets showing sunlit courtyards and laughing seniors arranged like props, while Elaine adopted the pained expression of a daughter doing the hard but necessary thing, and Martin pursued his role as neutral arbiter, assembling the case with careful bullet points that made my life feel like a slide deck. The coordinator explained how the community cooked meals and organized outings and dispensed medications at the proper times, and I listened with the expression I used on difficult students, polite but not credulous, and when she moved the conversation to next steps and produced a template for a durable power of attorney to make the transition seamless, I placed both palms on the table and told her in a tone that brooked no argument that the only thing seamless about my transition would be the end of this meeting. Elaine flushed and tried to laugh, saying I was in one of my moods, but I turned to her and said that no one would be taking authority over my life, certainly not via a form slid across my own kitchen table as if this were a luncheon club. And Martin, perhaps surprised by the steel in my voice, gathered the brochures without another word, while the coordinator left her card with a forced gentleness that betrayed her annoyance at losing a commission. Humiliation, however, does not always leave after the door closes. It hangs in the room and waits for its next opportunity, and it returned within 48 hours in a different disguise. A call from the bank's fraud department asking whether I was attempting to wire $12,000 to a new account in my daughter's name, a question so calmly put that for a second I wondered if I had misheard, then felt the old teacher's anger rise with the steadiness of a tide, not the wild fire of rage, but the measured certainty that a line had been crossed and must be marked. I told them the request was unauthorized, and they stopped it at once. They also told me, with admirable restraint, that someone had tried several times to log into my online banking from a device that had never connected before, and when I hung up, I went to my desk and discovered that my checkbook, which I kept in the second drawer beneath Margaret's framed letter about the year I won Teacher of the Year, was gone. I searched methodically as a man trained by decades of grading searches for a missing paper, checked the places where I sometimes absent-mindedly leave things, opened the pantry to see if I had slid it behind the sugar canister, and finally admitted to myself that it had been lifted during their previous visit, perhaps while the care coordinator was performing her benevolent monologue. I drove to the station and filed a report with an officer whose sympathetic eyes did not change the reality that this would be noted and forgotten unless it connected to something larger, and I returned home to find the porch light unscrewed, a small, petty act that, because of its pettiness, felt like the real message, a sign that they wanted me to feel watched and vulnerable, that their grievance had shifted from persuasion to harassment. The next morning brought a knock that carried a different cadence than a neighbor or a delivery driver. 2 people introduced themselves as investigators from Adult Protective Services, their voices kind but official, asking if they could come in to address a concern raised by a family member about my welfare. Years of teaching had taught me to recognize performance, so I put on a performance of my own, not false, but curated, inviting them into a living room free of clutter, opening the refrigerator to show fresh food properly labeled, demonstrating the pill organizer I filled every Sunday with the help of the instruction sheet Margaret had laminated years ago. And while they took notes, I baked a pan of cornbread according to the recipe I knew by heart, not because they needed a snack, though I offered them some when it was done, but because the measured sequence of mixing and watching and testing with a toothpick offered the most banal, irrefutable proof that I was not the helpless ghost they had been told to expect. One of them apologized quietly and said the report had been anonymous, and though we all knew what that meant, I thanked them for doing their duty and walked them to the door, and after they left, I sat with a slice of cornbread and let the humiliation pass through me like a storm that can be endured because one has taken precise shelter. That precision was rewarded the following day by my neighbor, a young father named Trent who coached Little League and waved every time he passed, who stopped me on the sidewalk to say that my daughter had knocked late the previous evening, asking whether he had a spare key to help with an emergency wellness check, and he had told her politely that any emergency could be handled by the police and that he did not possess such a key, which was true because I had never shared one, and in that small act of refusal I felt a thread of community tighten around me in a way I had not expected, as though the town itself had lightly placed a hand at my back. The hand steadied me when, that same afternoon, I found a notice tucked into my screen door announcing a scheduled home, showing for prospective buyers, a document so brazen I laughed aloud before calling the listing agent's number and explaining that the house was not for sale and that no one had authority to arrange a showing. The agent, to her credit, was mortified and said the booking had been placed by a woman claiming to possess the power of attorney. I asked for the woman's name, and the agent, after a pause in which she made a decision, read it to me, Elaine's. I asked for her email, wrote a quick summary of our conversation with the words, "No authority," in the first line, CC'd myself and printed a copy for my folder, and then called a lawyer whose card I found at the bottom of a drawer, a former student, now practicing elder law in the next town, who called me Mr. Mercer twice before switching to Ralph at my request and told me to come by first thing in the morning. In that modest office lined with diplomas that I remembered watching him chase as a high schooler who sat in the front row and argued respectfully, we built a defense that was also, quietly, an act of reclamation. He listened, asked questions that stacked us like blocks into a wall, and then suggested a series of steps that, taken together, would make it much harder for anyone to move the pieces of my life without my consent. We drafted a durable power of attorney naming, not a family member, but the trust department of the bank I had used for decades. A professional fiduciary with no holidays or grudges, we signed an advance directive naming my primary care physician and my old colleague Martha as healthcare proxies, and we prepared a simple, revocable living trust we decided to call the Margaret L. Mercer Trust, because saying my wife's name felt like laying a cornerstone, and we transferred the house into it with the crisp thunk of a deed sliding beneath a recorder's stamp. He explained that these measures did not make me invulnerable, nothing could, but they created a structure of yeses that would be very hard to undo with a handful of dishonest no's, and while the paralegal made copies, I sat very still and let the feeling of being a citizen flood back into me, the feeling that the law was not an enemy, but a tool I had a right to wield. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought new locks, a small fireproof safe, and a motion light for the porch. And at the electronics counter, I picked up a simple voice recorder the size of a thumb, the kind meant for students, and when I reached my kitchen, I unscrewed the old lock and replaced it while humming a tune Margaret used to sing when she was nervous, because I wanted the house to hear a sound that was not fear. None of these actions guaranteed peace, and in fact the pushback came quickly in the way bullies always respond when their first shove meets a planted foot. Elaine and Martin arrived unannounced midweek carrying a tote bag and a brittle brightness. That meant they were not here to apologize. They said they had cleared their evening to help me organize, and before I could say no, they had moved into the living room, Elaine asking where I kept my medical file and Martin heading for the desk as if he owned the room. And I stood where I was and told them that we would be discussing nothing without my lawyer present. Elaine rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic, and when I reached for my glasses to read the papers she had brought, I discovered they were not on the table where I had just set them, and I understood suddenly with a clarity that felt like a slap that they had hidden them to make me stumble. I did not give them the satisfaction of searching. Instead, I took the little recorder from my pocket, pressed the red dot, and set it on the mantel with a click loud enough to draw their eyes. And in a voice as calm as water, I asked them to repeat what they had said about my memory and the need for authority over my accounts. Perhaps it was the click, perhaps it was the tone, but their confidence faltered, and Elaine tried to pivot to pleasantries, asking about a casserole I might like, and I realized this was a rehearsal for a signature they intended to obtain elsewhere. A practice run to soften me up, which meant I had to let the play continue just enough to collect the lines. So I told them we could discuss everything over dinner on Saturday, that I wanted to hear their plan for my future with all the details, and they lit up in relief. Elaine, squeezing my shoulder in a gesture that might have once meant love, but now meant that the mark was back on the hook, and they left the house humming with what they assumed was victory, not noticing that I slipped my glasses case, which I found beneath a magazine on the end table, where it had never been before, into my pocket like a retrieved weapon. The retaliation, when it came, was mean, because meanness is what remains when an argument is lost. The lights went out just after dusk the next evening. The television flickered and died with a sigh, and when I stepped outside to check the neighborhood, I saw every house on the block lit except mine. I called the utility company, and the woman on the line told me a disconnect had been requested by the account holder earlier that afternoon, a phrase that made my scalp prickle, even as I told her calmly that I was the account holder, and that no such request had been authorized. She apologized and said it would take until morning to restore service. I lit candles, sat in the quiet glow, and thought about how humiliation had become their only lever, and I decided that the dinner I had proposed would not be a negotiation, but a stage, not for the confrontation they wanted, where I would sign away my rights to buy temporary calm, but for the unveiling I needed, where their intentions would be seen by someone other than me, and the consequences would begin to fall. I called my lawyer and asked him to be at the restaurant with a notary, not to sign their papers, but to witness mine. I called the bank manager and asked her if she would join us for a dessert coffee, under the pretense of answering questions about the care facility billing, a request she accepted with a gravity that suggested she had been waiting for my call. And I arranged for Martha, who had known me for 40 years and had a voice that could cut glass when it detected nonsense, to come as well and sit 2 tables away. That night, in the candlelight, I took Margaret's photograph from the mantel and held it as though it could warm my hands. I told her, aloud, that I was sorry it had come to this, that I had failed to teach our daughter what we thought we had taught her, that kindness without courage becomes enabling, and love without boundaries becomes a leash you tighten around your own throat. I promised her that the next day I would be a man she would recognize, not because I would raise my voice, but because I would not lower my eyes, and I slipped the photograph into the inner pocket of my jacket, the one I would wear to dinner, not as a talisman meant to change fate, but as a reminder that the life I was defending had been built by 2 people who had not been invisible to each other, and that if I could not make Elaine see me, I could at least make sure the world saw what she had become. The dinner I had arranged unfolded like a stage play in which every actor believed they understood their role, but only I knew the script that would bring the curtain down. The restaurant was softly lit, with candles trembling against the polished wood of each table, a place chosen deliberately because its intimacy forced words to hang heavy in the air, impossible to dismiss as background noise. Elaine and Martin arrived precisely on time, dressed carefully in that professional neatness that they wore like armor, expecting the evening to be a final persuasion, a gentle cornering of an old man into surrender. They smiled too brightly, offered me quick perfunctory embraces that smelled faintly of aftershave and perfume, and guided me to the table with the manner of handlers leading a charge to its pen. What they did not notice was the presence of my lawyer 2 tables behind, his notepad discreetly open, or the bank manager who had agreed to join for dessert, or Martha seated near the window, pretending to read a menu but watching with the sharp gaze of a woman who had no patience for deceit. Elaine began, as she always did, with the tender gravity of a daughter cloaking control in the guise of concern. "Dad," she said softly, "we know you've been struggling. We just want what's best for you. We've done some research, and we think it's time we move forward with a facility that can support you properly. Tonight, we can get the paperwork started. It will make everything easier." She slid an envelope across the table as if it were nothing more than a dinner bill, but I recognized the shape of legal forms beneath. Martin leaned forward with his steady engineer's certainty, pointing to sections where I should sign, speaking of health risks, of liability, of how seamless the transition would be. Their words spilled into the air like well-rehearsed lines, and for a long moment I allowed them to speak uninterrupted, nodding faintly as though overwhelmed, letting their confidence swell into complacency. When at last Elaine asked me to pick up the pen, I reached slowly, not for the envelope, but for the recorder in my pocket. I placed it on the table and pressed the button so that the small red light glowed between us. Her eyes flickered, confusion sparking. Before she forced another smile, "Dad, what are you doing?" she whispered. "Recording," I answered evenly, because it is time the truth was not just between us, but documented. "You tell strangers that I forget, that I cannot manage myself, that I am fragile. Yet here you are, attempting to secure my signature on papers that would give you control over my home and my accounts. Explain to me, Elaine, how those 2 stories fit together." For the first time, Martin faltered. He shifted in his chair, glanced around the restaurant, suddenly aware of the quiet hum of other diners, of eyes that might turn if voices rose. Elaine tried to recover, lowering her tone as though to soothe the child. "Dad, you're misunderstanding. This is for your safety. We just want to protect you from mistakes." I leaned forward and let my voice carry across the table with deliberate calm. "No, Elaine. Protection is bringing soup when someone is sick. Protection is checking that the porch light works. Protection is not forging narratives of incompetence so you can claim my property. That is theft dressed in filial affection." The envelope sat untouched between us, its presence growing heavier by the second. I tapped it lightly with one finger. "Do you want me to open this here and now? Shall we read aloud what guardianship you intend to claim? Or perhaps we can wait until dessert when the bank manager will join us, and you can explain to her why you attempted to access my accounts with fabricated stories of confusion." Elaine's composure cracked visibly, her cheeks flushing as Martin muttered that perhaps this was not the right place, perhaps they should talk privately. I let a faint smile curl at the corner of my mouth. "Privacy is what you wanted so that lies could flourish without witnesses. Tonight, there will be witnesses." Silence stretched between us, and for the first time in many years, I saw them as they truly were. Not as the children I once loved, not as the family I hoped to preserve, but as 2 adults who had calculated that their father's dignity was expendable if it meant greater comfort for themselves. It was Martin who broke the stillness, his voice tight with irritation. "You think you've been clever, Ralph, but you can't fight the tide. You're old. Inevitably, someone else will make decisions for you. If not us, then the state." I looked at him with a steadiness that made him falter. "Perhaps, but it will not be you. And tonight, this recording, These witnesses and the evidence I've collected ensure that you have already lost the right to even try." At that moment, the waitress approached with the dessert menus, and behind her came the bank manager, smiling politely as though this were a casual evening call, greeting me warmly and thanking me for inviting her. Elaine's lips parted in protest, but I gestured toward the envelope. "My daughter and her husband were just explaining a set of documents they wished me to sign. Perhaps you could help us understand the implications." Elaine's hand shot out to snatch the envelope back, but I was faster, sliding it across the table to the manager. Her expression did not change as she lifted the flap, skimmed the first page, and raised an eyebrow. "This appears to be a transfer of authority over all financial decisions. Are you certain you wish your father to sign this tonight?" Elaine stammered something about confusion, about safety, but the manager closed the envelope with quiet finality. "I believe I have seen enough." The rest of the dinner disintegrated in fragments. Elaine whispered desperate pleas that I was embarrassing them, that I was twisting everything. Martin's voice grew sharper, accusing me of paranoia, of poisoning the relationship. Martha rose from her table at last, walked over, and placed a hand on my shoulder with a firmness that silenced them both. "He is not alone," she said, her voice clear enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "And if you attempt this again, you will find more than your father standing in your way." They left soon after, their faces drawn tight with fury, the illusion of control shattered. I remained at the table a while longer, sipping my tea, the recorder still glowing between my hands. The climax was not in shouting, not in revenge, but in the simple act of reclaiming the voice they had tried so hard to silence. They had wanted invisibility for me, but in that room, before witnesses and strangers, I had made myself undeniable. After that dinner, the air seemed different, not because the seasons had shifted, but because the weight pressing down on my chest had at last been pushed back into the bodies of those who had placed it there. And for the first time in many years, I felt something akin to freedom, though not the carefree freedom of youth, but the harder, quieter kind that comes only after you have defended the last territory of yourself and found it still intact. Elaine and Martin did not call the next morning, nor did they come by in the following weeks, and the silence that once gnawed at me now rang with a strange relief, like a house after a storm when the power returns and you realize you have survived. At first I caught myself expecting them to reappear, perhaps with apologies rehearsed or excuses ready, but as the days stretched into weeks I understood that the confrontation had severed something that could not be mended, not by polite words or obligatory hugs, and instead of grieving that break, I began to accept it as necessary, the final act of protection I could give myself. I kept meeting with my lawyer, finalizing the structures we had put in place, and each signature I wrote felt less like bureaucracy and more like carving my initials into stone, proof that I still commanded the shape of my own life. The Margaret L. Mercer Trust became not just a legal entity, but a testament to the woman who had believed in me, and I imagined her smile at the thought that our modest savings and the house we had built would not be devoured by greed, but redirected towards something cleaner, something that might give shelter to children who had no one, or provide comfort to elders who, like me, had been treated as excess baggage by their families. I amended my will to state this plainly, and when I slid the papers into the safe beside her photograph, I felt a steadiness that no humiliation could erase. The town, in its quiet way, became more of a home to me than my own blood. Trent continued to wave each morning, sometimes stopping to chat longer now, and his children began to greet me with cheerful shouts when they played ball in the street. Martha visited often, bringing books and conversation, and we rediscovered the rhythm of old colleagues who had once debated history in the teacher's lounge, but now debated the peculiarities of modern life over cups of tea. At church I was approached by people who had heard fragments of what had happened at that restaurant, and though gossip has never been my preference, there was something affirming in the way their eyes softened, not with pity, but with respect, as though they saw me clearly for the first time in years. I was no longer the invisible man at the corner table. I was Ralph Mercer, a teacher, a husband, a man who had refused to be erased. Of Elaine and Martin I heard little, though once a mutual acquaintance mentioned that they had been arguing more openly that finances were tight, that the promotion Martin had expected had slipped away. I did not smile at the news, for spite had never been my aim, but neither did I ache with the old paternal instinct to rescue. They had chosen their path, and I had chosen mine, and for the first time I did not feel obligated to bridge the distance. Blood is a bond, yes, but respect is the true glue of family, and when that is stripped away, all that remains is paperwork and memory can be redefined by how one chooses to live the remainder of one's days. I found myself settling into a new rhythm, not the lonely stagnation of before, but a life that carried its own quiet dignity. I cooked small meals and invited neighbors to share them. I joined a community group at the library where seniors read aloud to children, and I even began tutoring history students who were struggling with their coursework. The act of teaching again, of seeing curiosity spark in young eyes, reminded me that my worth had never been dependent on the approval of those who dismissed me, but on the giving of what I carried to those willing to receive it. Each day closed not with the suffocating silence of neglect, but with the weary contentment of usefulness. And in that shift, I felt Margaret near me again, not as a ghost, but as a companion in purpose. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sun sink behind the rooftops, I thought of that dinner where I had been treated as invisible, where laughter had rolled over me as though I did not exist, and I contrasted it with the dinner where I had set the recorder down and reclaimed my voice. Between those two meals stretched the arc of my survival, from erasure to recognition, from despair to defiance, and though the story did not end with reconciliation, it ended with something more enduring, truth. I had not forced Elaine and Martin to see me, but I had ensured the world would, and in that decision I found a peace that was more real than any hollow apology could have provided. And so the resolution of my life's latest chapter is simple in words, but vast in feeling. I am not forgotten, not erased, not invisible. I walk each day with the knowledge that though I lost my family in the eyes of inheritance and convenience, I kept my integrity, my dignity, and my voice. They may have chosen to forget me, but I have chosen to remember myself, and in that choice lies a freedom greater than any they could ever have granted me.